there. What a great crowd. We're so happy to see you all here. My name is Jim Britton, and I'm the president of the City Club Board. The mission of City Club is to inform, connect, and engage to our community to strengthen the civic health of our region. We emphasize civil conversations and listening to others. We begin by acknowledging with humility that the land where we are here today is the territory of the people of the Salish Sea. Their presence is imbued in the waterways, shorelines, valleys, and mountains that are the traditional homelands of the Salish coastal people. And it has been that way since time immemorial. As always, we'd like to thank all of those who volunteered in order to make this event happen. Please give them a hand. In addition, we would like to acknowledge the support of our sponsors: Pacific Health, St. Joseph Medical Center, Baron Quinn Blackwell, Bruce and Claudia Descend, Danny Neal, real estate broker with the Moliat Group, Firehouse Arts and Event Center, Colshan CPAs, Opportunity Council, Pacific Continental Realty, Salish Current, Unity Care Northwest, Village Books, Western Washington University, and the Whatcom Community Foundation. Let's give them a big hand. And finally, I'd like to give a big thanks to our caterer, Good Bowls, and our videographers, Talking to Crows. For those of you who are not members and attending today, I would like to encourage you to consider becoming a member. Membership provides the bulk of the financial support that we rely on in order to continue to present these great programs. To become a member, the dues are $40 a person, $70 for a household of two, and $10 for those who are under 10. 10. Under 25. Got my 10s twice in a row. If you'd like to join, you can do it in 3 different ways. You can go to the website and be prompted to do it that way. On each of your tables, there is a form you could fill out and let us know you're interested in becoming a member, and we will follow up and arrange to get your dues. Or you could, before you leave today, talk to our treasurer, who was back there, Zach Nordwell, and he could take care of it before you leave. So next month, we're going to be taking a deeper dive into what we opened up today, and that is looking in more detail at the foreign policy and relationships between us and the Canadians, and us and the Mexicans. Our speakers will be Dr. Lori Troutman, who serves as one of the nation's experts on U.S. and Canadian relationships, and Dr. Latrell Scherfius, who is an expert in Mexican history and U.S.-Mexican relations. So it should be another really good program, and I encourage you to mark your calendars and come and join us next month. Finally, I'd like to remind everyone to please silence your cell phones if you haven't already done so. And with that, I want to introduce our moderator for this event, and that's Jane Freudenberg.
Hello, everybody. Well, are you like me? Do you wake up every morning thinking, what has he done now, or what's happening? I think we all are. And the latest news reporting is always kind of dire. And no matter what your political persuasion is, it's kind of mind-boggling, the change in direction that's taken place in our country. So we are fortunate today to have Nick Mealy to come and hope to make some sense of it all out for us. Nicholas is certainly currently a senior advisor to Pax Christi USA for nuclear issues. After the Peace Corps service in South Korea, Nick joined the United States Information Agency as a Foreign Service Officer and has 25 years of experience and service in Asia and Africa. Nick retired at the end of 1999 and began working for the Nonviolent Peace Force in 2001 as its first communications director. So Nick, welcome to City Club, and the mic is yours.
I'll try this one.
Oh, that's right.
Oops. Nope. Okay, I think. No? It's here. I'm on. Is that better? Thank you. Due to technical difficulties beyond my control, this talk is canceled. So you all heard something about me. I'd like to know a little bit about you. And I'm going to ask you a couple of questions, and I'd just like you to raise your hand. The first question I wonder is, how many of you have lived in a country outside the U.S. that is not Canada? Oh, a lot of you. Okay. How many of you either worked for the U.S. government directly or as a contractor to the U.S. government? Uh-oh, I've got to be honest. Okay. A little bit more about me than I told Jane. One is that I am by profession an explainer, not an orator. So I've been asked to answer some questions. And what I want to do is, rather than tell you what I think, I'd like to look a little bit at both our history in foreign relations, but also what's going on currently. It makes it a very challenging topic because, as you probably are all aware, and as Jane said, every day there's some new disturbing piece of news. So the first question had to do with our relationship, Whatcom County's relationship with British Columbia. And the first thing I can say is, if you really want to know, tomorrow or Friday or Saturday, go up to Costco and count the Canadian license plates in the parking lot. I think it's better now. Seriously, though, that's kind of a flip answer. But the truth is, I don't believe that there are going to be anything more than flutters in the county's relationship with British Columbia for a couple of reasons. One of them is that our economies are intertwined. They've been intertwined long before NAFTA, long before President Trump's Canada, US, Mexico trade agreement, the one that he didn't remember negotiating. And those are deep ties. Of course, the other thing is, unless you count the ditch behind H Street, there's really no barrier on the border. Well, there is an electronic barrier. The Mounties and our people have lots of stuff up there. But both sides, both Canadians and Whatcom people, cross the border regularly for work, for recreation, for shopping, and also because they have family on both sides of the border. the Peace Arch on the U.S. side says children of a common mother. And on the Canadian side, do you know what it says? It says brethren dwelling together in unity. And I really think that is what will prevail. Across the U.S., because I'm going to broaden this out to include the people who had their electricity cut off and things like that. Across the U.S.-Canadian border, that is the most peaceful border in the world. Since, I guess, the War of 1812, there have been no standing up of the military along that border. A lot of the border is inaccessible, and that might have something to do with it. But the fact is, it was a very permeable border. It's a very peaceful border. And really, I think in the long term, the least of our worries is what will happen between Whatcom County and British Columbia. We may suffer some economic downturns, as we have in the past, but that leads into a conversation I had with a Canadian, because I do my research when I'm asked to speak. So I ran into this Canadian online at a grocery store, and we started talking, and she told me that a lot of grocery prices are now cheaper in Canada than they are here. This was a good tip to get. They also don't have an egg shortage. So that's illustrative maybe of the friendliness that Canadians and Americans on our part of the border feel for each other. But we do have a perception problem. And that perception problem is not Americans as people and is not entirely caused by the policies of the Trump administration. Just to speak a little bit in history, back when I was working overseas, the most popular U.S. television program, and it was everywhere, was Baywatch. All Americans are blonde, jiggle, and wear swimsuits all the time. Also, there's an awful lot of crime at the beach. I'm making light of it, but this is very much the perceptions of people. I worked for the U.S. Information Agency, which almost no one has ever heard of in the U.S., because when we were created during the Eisenhower administration, Congress feared that people who were skilled at communicating might be used to advance the agenda of a partisan politician. Nothing like what we have now. But because of that, we were not allowed to talk about ourselves. We were not allowed to advertise our products. 2 of our products actually got special congressional action to be released in the U.S. One was a documentary film, very old now, called Jesse Owens Returns to Berlin, about the great athlete's time at Hitler's Olympics. The second film was a film about the John F. Kennedy and the assassination. I suppose it's available again with all the documents that have been released. But the point is that we used to have an agency that tried to counter misunderstandings about the U.S., misperceptions, and we no longer do. Yeah, the State Department has a department or a Bureau of Public Affairs. It's much reduced from what we were. And by the way, it's probably not going to survive if you look at the Voice of America, which how many of you have ever listened to the Voice of America? You can get it, well, you used to be able to get it here if you had a shortwave radio. So the Voice of America, starting actually during the Second World War, is an international broadcaster, or is maybe more proper to say, an international broadcaster, broadcast in English and in a lot of other languages. I don't know how many of you have ever listened to the BBC. I'm not going to, yeah, a good number. I'm not going to mention the CBC. We all listen for the news there, right? Anyway, that's what the Voice of America theoretically does, although no longer. Mostly now it plays elevator music. And that's a shame, because now more than ever, we need to have professionals projecting an accurate image of who we are. Now, that's a pretty complex thing, obviously. But right now, most people around the world get their impressions of America from Netflix, possibly Amazon Prime, and all of those streaming services, and all of those news services, the ones nobody in this room watches, like Newsmax. Anybody watch Newsmax? You should. It's instructive. It's important to know what's being said by all the parties on the political spectrum, and you should listen. When he was still alive, I used to listen to Rush Limbaugh regularly. You got to know. You really do. And the one request I'll make of you is try to get outside of our bubbles and listen to different points of view. I just read in a book by Arlie Russell Hochschild about rural people and the rural-urban divide, that Democrats are much less prone to cross the divide and talk to people on the other side than Republicans. So shame on all you people who don't listen to Newsmax. Back to the point about how is the U.S. perceived? There have always been misconceptions, and you never know how a foreign audience interprets what they do see. So we were in Southeast Asia, in Malaysia, which is a very advanced country in a lot of ways. And we had CNN and a bunch of other international broadcasters. One of the best things that ever happened to the U.S. in Malaysia was the O.J. Simpson trial. It was. And the reason it was people looked at that and said, look at that. Even this black guy in the U.S. can get a fair trial. And he got acquitted. That was a big, big positive. We didn't have to justify our criminal system. We stopped having to answer questions about the civil rights movement. A lot of those things were made very clear by the way that trial was conducted and the way it worked. However, that was, of course, a partial look at America. It didn't cover a lot of other things. My own experience, both from personal interactions and professionally, is that most people around the world perceive the United States as basically pretty good people, but they're awfully arrogant, and they kind of are clueless about the rest of the world. Those of you who've traveled, somewhere in your travels, you have perhaps come across, or maybe you were at one time, one of those people who thinks, if I just speak slowly and loudly, all these Chinese people will understand. I've seen it thousands of times. We often, it's unconscious. We're clueless because we operate almost exclusively in an English language environment. Even here, people, when I drive friends across the border, they're stunned by the French on the Canadian border crossing. Well, they have two official languages. We didn't used to have any. We do now. But lately, this perception of the U.S. as a force for good in the world has been slipping. And by lately, I mean since January 21st. Particularly among the leaders. I think most people around the world still kind of, to put it simply, like Americans, because we're kind of, what you see is what you get. We're out there. They're puzzled by us often, but, they know basically we're softies. However, what's been going on in Washington has really started people thinking, maybe the U.S. isn't the most reliable partner we can find. One cause, it's worth talking about the causes. One cause is simply the rhetoric. With all due respect to the president, when you keep talking about lunatics and bomb and destroy and invasion, those are not confidence-building terms. They just aren't. His statements sow confusion, and they strike many people as hostile and overly aggressive. Invasion is kind of a tough word. Canada should become the 51st state. That's a tough word in a lot of ways, one of which is he doesn't realize that there are territories and provinces in Canada that are different significantly. And he apparently doesn't know any Canadians speak French as their first language. So rhetoric is a problem. Another problem is the conflicting statements he makes. So, for example, when he criticized the Canada-US-Mexico trade agreement that he negotiated and said, who did that? Who suggested that? Some of you are laughing. Some of us believed him that it wasn't him. But overseas, everybody knew it was him, and they thought, what's wrong with this man? Quite seriously. Now, there's been a history in not only in the US, but in some other countries. There's a thing called the madman theory of deterrence. And what that means, and Richard Nixon was a master at this, and I mean truly, he was very good at it. You project the image of being totally unpredictable and possibly irrational. The North Koreans are very good at this too. In fact, they don't even have to think. I think they just do it. But that doesn't seem to be what's going on with Donald Trump, because one minute he's making threats and the next minute the threats drop. So I have lost count of the number of times he said, these tariffs are going into effect on this date, and then a day or two before that date postpones them. For you and me, it's maybe confusing, it's maybe laughable, but for foreign leaders, and by leaders I don't just mean government people, I also mean business leaders, academic experts, military leaders. I guess they're government people. The fact is, they don't know what he means. And that's a problem. One reason the U.S., since the end of the Second World War, has been a leader in the world is because people know where we stand, or knew where we stand. That's not so obvious now. Finally, and I will speak, I guess, at some length on this, there is the disregard for existing international structures. I don't just mean alliances, military treaties. I also mean economic structures. Please remember that the World Trade Organization pretty much collapsed during the first Trump term. Some of that was probably the pandemic, but a lot of it was President Trump's disdain. And that has serious consequences for the whole world, which I'll get to. If I start with World War II, beginning in World War II until January 21st, 2025, people understood that there was a structure of international agreements. There was the United Nations and some other bodies, WHO, the World Health Organization. There's an International Labor Organization under UN auspices, UNESCO, UNICEF, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So there's a whole body of agencies and a whole body of treaty and international law that kind of kept the world fairly stable. Sure, there were conflicts, but there hasn't been a world war since 1945. According to the Union of Concerned Scientists, we're closer now than we ever have been since then, 89 seconds away from doomsday. Why? Well, partly it's because that structure of alliances and organizations has been disassembled. this is not just President Trump. We started pulling out of treaties in the George W. Bush administration. And Mr. Obama, when he was president, tried to put some treaties in place. But Mr. Trump took us out of the last remaining arms control treaties, for example. That's serious business. As you heard, I work on nuclear issues for a non-governmental organization. And we are very close to a new nuclear arms race. Some people think it's already happened. Looking around the room, I can see many of you remember the first one. At its height, we had over 70,000 nuclear warheads deployed in the world. Any guesses on how many there are right now? 14,000. Okay, but the US, Russia, and China are all building or planning to build new weapons and new delivery systems. France has just announced, for understandable reasons, that they're going to extend their nuclear arsenal. There's a lot of danger out there. Pulling the US out of the World Health Organization means we don't get early warnings the way we used to of potential pandemics. So these things make the world a much less secure place. I'm not saying there'll be a third world war, but I think since we already have some pretty hot wars like in Ukraine and whatever is going on in Sudan, there's a lot of potential for conflict. And then there's Israel, Palestine, and the Middle East. There's a lot of conflict that could erupt into wider conflict. In that unstable situation, it's really unfortunate that people can't figure out where the US stands. But that's where we are. And the closure of the Voice of America, and the closure of USAID, and all the chaos that they see on their news in Washington makes them feel much less like they can rely on the US. Now, Mr. Trump is a disruptor. That's one of the things he does, is he tears things down. That's not a bad idea. Both Presidents Roosevelt were disruptors. John F. Kennedy was a disruptor. He got killed for it, maybe. Abraham Lincoln was a disruptor, and we all paid or our ancestors paid the price. Some disruption is constructive, but some is destructive. And right now, US support for liberal democracies and US championship of human rights seems to be weakening. That's a euphemism. Not only have we broken long-standing alliances, the US-French alliance goes back to before there was a United States. We all learned, because we're old, we learned that in history. We were a lot closer to it. Well, when you take that down, all of that stuff, everybody's at sea. That's dangerous, or potentially dangerous. And there will be consequences for all of us. But there's another system that was put together after World War II, and that is the international financial system, which relies on the dollar. And the net impact of on-again, off-again tariffs, trade threats, invasion threats, all of this, along with the often conflicting statements that the president makes about the Federal Reserve, the dollar, this and that, are going to lead us down a path where we will have serious economic consequences. If the dollar becomes no longer the standard for financial transactions around the world, the US will suffer, all of us. It won't just be high-priced eggs because of bird flu. It will be everything. These tariffs as you've probably heard, ad nauseum, mean that we're going to be paying more for everything from television sets to houses. And that's a reality that's too often overlooked and is too often not discussed or covered in the mainstream news media. And it's not discussed at all in the right-wing news media. So the way that the budget is talked about, here's a little budget thing. In July, we will reach our debt ceiling. They're saying May now. The last I saw was July. I believe you, Jill, May. So what does that mean? That means we won't be able to borrow money at worst. At best, we'll be downgraded again, as we were the last time who was president. Anybody know? It's from New York. So this kind of random, and that's what it looks like from the outside, random destruction of not only domestic U.S. organizations and structures, but the whole international community. Imagine, I don't know how many of you are in neighborhood associations. I assume a fair number. Imagine if your neighborhood association, as has happened to some condo associations, not the one I'm in, they start fighting with each other and alliances change and issues change. What happens to the neighborhood? It goes downhill. That's what's happening right now as we speak. Can you guess I'm a pessimist? I was also asked to talk about why the closure of USAID was so harmful. This is a very easy topic. First of all, people have died and people are dying because of the withdrawal of food aid, medical aid, and simple economic development. Others are simply suffering from disease and malnutrition. Some of them will die, some of them won't. That alone is a reason to be opposed. Lots of good Americans who worked for USAID, either as USAID employees or as employees of the different private agencies, non-governmental for the most part, that cooperated with AID. I happen to do some advocacy work for an organization called Catholic Relief Services, which took 65% of its program budget in the form of funds from AID. Not only did AID get reduced to, I think the number is 40 employees, but the Catholic Relief Services had to let go hundreds and hundreds of employees, many of them, as with AID, overseas. The thing is, a lot of the non-governmental organizations' overseas employees are citizens of the country where they work. They can't return to the US and look for a better job or another job. They're stuck where they are, which is often places that have serious health issues, serious food supply issues, and even civil war. Just think of the Democratic Republic of the Congo, Sudan, South Sudan, Ukraine. We could go on, but I'll stop. The second problem is all of the Americans who have lost their jobs. Now, they've been characterized by Mr. Musk and others as, radical leftist lunatics. Anybody here work for AID ever? There, okay, there's a couple of you. Most employees of AID, in my experience, are specialists in something, engineers, agronomists, plant biologists, or they're managers. U.S. government employees, and neither Trump nor Musk seem to know this, are not allowed by law to be partisan. We can lose our jobs if we're partisan. It's as simple as that. They've loosened up a little bit, but when I was working in Washington, D.C., I couldn't put a presidential bumper sticker on my car, which I never took to the office, by the way. I took public transportation. However, it was against the law. to even put a bumper sticker on your car. So those people are suffering now. They had almost no notice to pack up, move out of wherever they were. And some of the places they were are very hard to get out of. There just aren't a lot of flights. The people working in Sudan, I don't know how many of them were American, because of the civil war, were risking their lives to leave. And that's true in other places in the world. All of which tends to undermine confidence in the U.S. and damages our position in the global community as a reliable partner. There's also the fact that countries that receive U.S. economic assistance tend to look favorably on American products and services, and they tend to import them. When I first worked in Korea as a Peace Corps volunteer, Korea was a net economic aid recipient of the U.S. Korea is now a major exporter to the U.S. I don't know how many of you have Samsung or Gold Star or Hyundai or Kia products, but there they are. They also buy U.S. products. And that's another loss, economic loss we're going to have. As you may not think the Sudan has the potential to be a huge part of the world economy, but it does because of the mineral deposits there, especially fossil fuels. And we're going to lose that. But most importantly of all, we're losing the goodwill that USAID generated. What do I mean by goodwill? Well, when I worked in Africa, the only other U.S. government people there were two USAID employees. They were both agricultural economists, and they were engaged in training agricultural economists, but also to a certain extent in distributing emergency food supplies. This was during the Sahelian famine back in the day. I went on a trip with one of them, not far, 30, 40 miles from the town I was based in. And every time we stopped, a crowd of people seeing the USAID symbol, which is a hand clasped over the U.S. shield, would crowd around the car. A, to thank us, but B, to look for handouts because they were hungry. The lack of compassion and the lack of understanding of how the world works by the geniuses in the Trump administration is an indication of how incompetent they all are. The news that's been dominating the headlines for the last 2 days prove that they also are not only amateurs, they're also stupid. You don't mention the name of an active intelligence officer over an unsecured communications channel. You just don't, and everybody knows that. Furthermore, presidential appointees who are going to handle anything classified have to get a briefing on how to deal with communications, how to deal with files, all of that. And at least when I was working, and even as a contractor, I had to sign a document that said, I have received this briefing and understood it. So, Secretary Hegseth, Tulsi Gabbard, all of them, they all should be fired. They've committed a crime. So, the next question I was asked, is there any way of turning this around? Well, I don't know. I'll tell you what the former deputy director of USAID, Atul Gawande, the surgeon and writer, was interviewed a couple of weeks ago on the New Yorker radio hour. And the last question that David Remick put to him was, what are the chances this can be turned around? And Dr. Gawande said, 0. You've destroyed everything. You know, there's no confidence anymore in the U.S. government in a lot of these places. And he's not talking about just the people who lost their emergency food supplies or their medicines or whatever. He means the government leaders too. 0. And all of the people who were experts, who had all this years of experience, they have been let go? How many of them do you think will want to come back? And that's a question I have, and I'm still asking people. You know, there are people who are suing, and there have been some court decisions that say that the firings were illegal and they have to do this and they have to do that. But of course, the strategy for the administration, as frankly it is for most administrations, is to just keep kicking the can up to the Supreme Court, which can take years. Well, 3 years without food means a lot of dead people. 3 years without medicine means a lot of dead people. But what it mostly means is a lot of really disappointed leaders in those countries. It's going to be a problem. I was asked, how long do I think it will take to turn it around? I have no idea because I don't know how long and how far we're going to cut. I wanted to let you know that when we talk about cuts to the U.S. government, I'm always fascinated by where they're taken. So I don't know how many of you know the last presidential administration that cut government agencies. Anybody know? Clinton, yeah. It was my agency. Well, it was one of them. That's okay. In return for my job, we got a chemical weapons ban treaty ratified. So that was good. Some consolation. There's no consolation for the USAID, Voice of America, Department of Education, HHS, CDC. You can run down the list. Even the domestic agencies, many of them have a presence overseas. The largest U.S. embassies can have as many as 50 different federal agencies in them. In addition to the State Department, the intelligence services, and the Department of Commerce. I'll bet you not too many knew the Commerce Department has a foreign service, but they do. And they have outposts, particularly in countries that look likely to be future markets for the U.S. and future trading partners. But there's also the Department of Agriculture has the Animal and Plant Health Inspection Service, which goes into countries that export animal and plant products to the U.S. and certifies that they're safe to be brought in. The FBI operates overseas, the Drug Enforcement Agency, the Immigration Enforcement people, NASA, the Smithsonian Institution. I'm waiting for Elon Musk to cut the Smithsonian because that's like some of the others. That's an organization created by Congress, and the president has nothing to do with it. Another thing that I'm asked is, how long will this take? I have no idea. I will tell you my own experience. When my agency, the U.S. Information Agency, was basically abolished, a bunch of us moved into the State Department. But not all, and we had lost a lot of the assets that we had, both overseas and in the U.S. People said, oh, in 10 years they'll reinvent us because they'll have to. Well, it's been 26 years now, and there's still no new, under any name, U.S. Information Agency that tries to counter misperceptions and misinformation around the world. Where is the main source of misinformation and disinformation against the U.S.? It's Russia. Surprise! It's been Russia since the Cold War. No matter how much President Trump wants to be Russia's friend, there's some things that have to stop for us to be Russia's friend, and that's one of them. Another one is the various war crimes. Using North Koreans as troops isn't exactly a war crime, but it's a pretty miserable thing to do. North Koreans are poor, they're ill-nourished, and they don't have any say. It's not like, it's a lot like Vietnam when people of my generation were drafted and sent to Vietnam. But the North Koreans get nothing from that. They get killed, wounded, but their leaders get, I don't know what they're getting, but I assume they're getting money or hard goods or something. So I do want to end on a positive note, and there are some positive notes. No, there truly are some positive notes. One of them concerns my particular area these days, nuclear weapons. President Trump has done a couple of encouraging things. 2 or 3 times he's publicly stated that we have to do something to limit the number of nuclear weapons in the world. That's great. There's an opening there. No one knows whether he's raised this with Vladimir Putin or not, because no one listens to those conversations. But the fact that he's even saying it is a good thing. The fact that he sent feelers out, a little ambiguous and a little weak, to Iran is a good thing. We had a nuclear weapons development program in Iran that was stopped by a treaty negotiated by the Obama administration in conjunction with our NATO partners, the Soviet Union, Russia and China. Who broke that up? Mr. Trump pulled us out of it. So now that he's seen the error of his ways, that's encouraging. It is encouraging. All right. I also think, as unlikely as it seems to me, it's possible that some of this disruption and shutting down whole agencies by a bunch of high school kids, essentially, whose loyalty, by the way, is not to the Constitution, not to the administration, but to Elon Musk. That's a violation of the Constitution. And if you're not writing our people in Washington and saying how disappointed you are in all of this, please do. All right? It's egregious. Now, I don't care if you're a Democrat, a Republican, a libertarian, whatever. The Constitution is what holds us together as a nation. And if the Constitution falls apart, then we will experience chaos in some form, just like shithole countries, to use a phrase made popular by the president. But there are these good things going on, a few of them. And there's the fact that, he hasn't yet invaded Canada or Greenland. But people don't know what he's talking about. I personally think he's a very transactional, he likes bargaining and negotiating. And I think all this talk is intended, at least as far as Greenland goes, to get more concessions for bases there. And it's not insane, and Canada is not insane. What is the effect of global warming on the polar ice cap? It's shrinking. Suddenly, someday we're going to wake up and there's going to be a sea route through the Arctic Circle. Russia already has one when that happens, just because of their, geographic location. We don't. We have a peace in Alaska, but Canada and Greenland sounds pretty good. Now, ignore the fact that we've been cooperating with Canada for decades on North American defense. Every Christmas, there's a cute little story from NORAD, right? Which says, and Santa Claus has crossed the Arctic Circle. He's coming to deliver, and everybody cheers. What they don't focus on is that that's a nice thing, but that is the result of a bilateral structure that was set up. And I haven't heard any Canadian politician, actually I have heard a Canadian politician say, well, maybe we should get out of NORAD. That would harm our defense directly at a time of heightened tension, and there's just no knowing. I'm starting to ramble, and I said I'd end on a happy note, and here I am. Do I understand that you're going to be asking questions? Okay.
Okay, so I've been reading a lot lately about, there's been letters in the Cascadia and elsewhere about relationship with Putin. And do you think the claims that he's been cultivated by Moscow for decades, does the Foreign Service believe that?
Okay, I have no idea. I think it's like any group. Some people believe it, some people don't believe it. Some people think he's a genius and this is all a ruse so that he can get Putin where he wants him. I have no idea. I will say that what happened a couple of days ago, as revealed by the editor-in-chief of The Atlantic, does not give me a lot of hope.
Hope that they aren't.
Well, I'm not a conspiracy theorist. I know that there are conspiracies, but all this stuff, the Steele dossier was proven to be a hoax, right? There is no concrete evidence other than his evident adulation for Putin. But think of who else he loves. Bukele, Orban. I mean, he likes Kim Jong-un. Yeah, he likes dictators. Okay. I don't know whether that's wish fulfillment or whether it's genius, but there it is.
Well, doesn't he think that gives him a dictatorship? You can tell everybody what to do. He doesn't like to follow the rules.
I'm not going to make that judgment. I'll just point out that he's got a hell of a lot of lawsuits right now to deal with as president.
That's another question. So he has all these lawsuits going before all these courts, and we all have our fingers crossed, but how do they enforce them if he decides to ignore it? I don't only know international affairs. You got me. I think that's up to, that's up to the police forces, and that means the FBI. That means the Secret Service. That means ultimately it may mean the military. Now, our military, we're very fortunate as a country that our military has absolutely no tradition of interfering in domestic affairs. And I say that as someone who worked very closely with the U.S. Army and the U.S. Air Force and the U.S. Navy throughout my career, both in the U.S. and overseas. And they are not interested. Why do you think he fired so many generals? I mean, it's because when he goes in and says, I want you to do this, the generals say, well, I'm sorry, Mr. President, we can't do that. You're out. The problem he has is that the entire officer corps has the same ethos. They don't interfere in domestic politics. And there are police forces to deal with domestic crime. What will happen? I don't know. All right, I'm going to open this to the... Okay, we've got Jill over here. And Amy, there she is in the back with the mic. So come on, folks. I'm sure you have questions. And make it a question, please, not a statement. Yeah, kind of help out the...
Thank you. You mentioned the tariffs going up and down, and I just wonder if I'm the only person thinking that that could be due to insider trading, announcing tariffs, stocks go down, next day tariffs are off, stocks go up. Just wondered if anybody else had that thought.
Nick?
I haven't had that thought. But I'm not in finance. I noticed that the overall trend of my investments is down. So I don't think there's anything nefarious, but who knows? I think that what we should be much more worried about is what's going to happen when the dollar slides and we're no longer the currency, that the currency standard for world trade and world banking. And what's going to happen is going to be very difficult for every single American resident.
Mr. Mealy, for your insights. Is this what? Yes. Good. So it can be helpful to know the motivation behind actions to figure out how to counter those actions. And I'm trying to figure out whether the motivation here is some well-intentioned people who are just incompetent. That seems unlikely, but possible. Is it Trump's own personal vendettas and sicknesses that causes him to want to create this destruction in the world? Is it a desire to steal all the money on the part of Elon Musk and Trump and their affiliates? What do you think is the goal here?
You know, if all these questions are going to be outside my area of competence, this is going to be very easy for me. I have no idea what goes on in the minds of even my wife, much less the Elon Musks of the world. I mean, honestly, I think that the principle that I've tried to live by, both as a diplomat and as a human being, is presume good intentions. Like I said a minute ago, I'm not a conspiracy theorist, although I know a lot of people are. But I have no idea what the motive is. I think part of it is Mr. Trump likes to be controversial. And he certainly, has outdone himself so far this year. But he's not the only one that likes to be controversial. And he's not the only player in this field. We think he is. Ask the Europeans. They have a different opinion.
People are asking, so what is the, like I should be competent to handle this, right? So what are the Europeans saying?
Well, here's where I have something good to say. A lot of European leaders are saying, well, he's right. We do have to take more. We've lived kind of very happily under the umbrella of the U.S. military, and we do need to step up and do more. Now, how many of them like that, I don't know. And there are risks inherent in that. If you look at the rise of some of the parties in Germany and in France, which are fortunately still fringe parties, go beyond right wing and are very alarming, and in other places as well. But the fact of the matter is, the Europeans acknowledge that Trump has a point, that the U.S. is bearing too much of the burden. Think about this. This May is 80 years since VE Day. We still have over 60,000 U.S. troops stationed in Europe. You know where most of them are? Most of them are in Germany. And there's a good number in Italy. Oh, but those wars are over.
Yep.
Right? Now, there's some in Belgium, too. And there's one other place. Oh, and then there's the UK, but that's not part of Europe anymore.
Let me see if I can land one closer to your wheelhouse. 40 years ago or so, the Pacific Salmon Treaty was negotiated, running from, which deals with all the salmon that migrate through the Canadian waters and are harvested by both Alaskans, U.S., southern U.S., and Canadians. That treaty is up for renegotiation. How does the State Department staff that? Because there were State Department people all over those negotiations. The same is true of the Columbia River Treaty, which is up for renegotiation, and the Colorado River Treaty, which is based on a flow in the Colorado River, which hasn't been seen since the 1920s, is also up for renegotiation. How does the State Department deal with that?
So this one I actually know, because the last time the U.S.-Canada Fisheries Agreement was up, I was in Washington and had to deal with it. The State Department works very closely with I forget what the arm of, is it the Fisheries Bureau, or, they work with those people who know, they work with the Coast Guard who monitor these agreements, and they work as part of a team of negotiators, negotiating with a similar team on the Canadian part. I don't know how many people are working on it just yet, but I would bet that there are people in the government, in the federal government on this side, who are already looking at things like the salmon runs here and how they're fluctuating or not, and beginning to stake out positions for negotiations. The thing is, there's a wild card here, which is how many of them will still have jobs when they actually sit down around the table. And that's part of what I'm trying to convey to you. We are in an increasingly precarious position as a nation. There's a lot of people. I'm not in charge of picking.
Hi. First of all, thank you for being here today. And my question has to do with Russia. There's an article in the BBC that says that President Trump's supporters actually like Putin because they see him as very conservative and part of the culture wars. And this person was claiming that culture wars are now part of foreign policy. Any thoughts on that?
It's always been true. It hasn't been quite as ever polarized as it is now, but certainly. I'll give you a very simple example. During the Reagan administration, remember that? ABC showed a made-for-TV film called The Day After about a nuclear attack on Lawrence, Kansas, I believe it was. ABC offered the film to the U.S. government to be shown around the world. And the U.S. government, the Reagan administration said, okay, sure. So we started showing it. And then the culture warriors, actually the Cold War superhawks in the Reagan administration and outside the Reagan administration said, you can't show that. That's an anti-nuclear weapons film. I'm kind of stunned at the thought of a pro-nuclear weapons film, but so be it. So they pulled it. We all got a telegram. In those days, we still used telegrams, not email. And everybody in the world, every foreign service establishment in the world, got a telegram saying, if you have any showings planned, stop them. You can't do this anymore. It never happened. Now, that's the kind of thing that does happen. As far as American groups, I'll give you maybe a more relevant example, which was that when Indonesia, as a nominally Muslim country, which it was when I was there in the early 80s, Indonesia had a prohibition against, you could come in as a missionary, you just couldn't be an active proselytizer. You couldn't go door to door. For that reason, they forbade anybody from the church of from the LDS church from operating in Indonesia. This was a constant issue for us in the embassy in Jakarta, because from time to time, somebody in the Reagan administration would contact us and say, you have to do your utmost to, it's unfair treatment. Well, it was unfair treatment. On the other hand, Indonesia is an independent country and sets its own rules, right? Something to be considered. So this stuff comes up all the time. As far as Putin being a conservative, that's not the word. He wants the Russian Empire back. I personally believe he would like to be crowned czar. I don't know if that's true, but I mean, he certainly acts as if he does. On the other hand, let's not demonize the guy. He's a man of a certain age, like our own president. And new ideas, often the older gents among us tend to resist. And also, we tend to resist the idea that we're not the center of the universe. Look at me, I'm up here speaking.
Hello. I wanted to ask a question. Do you think that there is any way we could stop this narcissistic sociopath and muskrat with with the revolt with the people in the United States through protests and resistance and coming out? That we could actually stop what he's doing in addition to the courts? And secondly, do you think that do you think the Supreme Court's really going to let him get away with this?
Outside my area of expertise, here's all I can say about this. The courts are the first line of defense at this point, since Congress has abdicated all responsibility. But the courts and the politicians on both sides of the aisle do need to know how we feel. Frankly, since the closure of AID, I have at least 3 hours a week, spent about 3 hours a week writing, calling, whatever, our congressman and also some others, Mike Johnson for one, because he's responsible for the whole agenda in the House. And here's the thing about that. I'm glad you gave me the opportunity to make this plug. I hear time and time again from people, well, they don't listen to us. So, Rick Larson, I was talking about 2 weeks ago with one of his staffers, a fellow who does foreign affairs for him. So it was all over and above. I was, trying to make sure that they were on the same page about the end of U.S. economic assistance and that Rick was doing stuff he should be doing. And this staffer, who will not be named, said, well, normally we get 105 constituent contacts. That's everything. That's phone calls, emails, and that's complaints about bills. That's my Social Security check didn't come. That's my next door neighbor built a fence on my side of the property line. I mean, it is. It's all, they get all of that. He said, since February 1st, we are averaging something like 1,000, 1,600 contacts like that a week. So it does, and they pay attention. And it's not just the Democrats that pay attention. You want to change things, not only should each of us be bugging our congressional delegation, we should tell all our relatives, you don't like it? Send an email, make a phone call, whatever it is. So yeah, there is, and I personally feel like I've aged out of demonstrations and protests, but I think it's a good thing for people whose legs are better than mine to do. Well, I've got some up here that have been going. Okay. All right, after you.
I think this one will be closer to your line of thinking. I'm interested in how the closure of USAID ultimately impacts American farmers.
Well, the farmers know. I'll throw out some statistics which I've avoided. So Washington State exports roughly $7 billion a year. Now, some of that is Boeing planes and Microsoft, subscriptions and stuff like that. But about half, maybe more than half, is agricultural products. So when USAID stops buying those products, some farm, and by the way, dairy products are a big one. I couldn't find what the numbers are for Whatcom County. But I know from myself going to black markets and buying big things of cheese that say donated by U.S. Agency for International Development overseas. Roughly $4 billion of agricultural exports a year. I don't know what percentage is bought and distributed, has been bought and distributed by USAID. But one person in the state government told me about $500,000 a year from Western Washington, $500,000 worth of agricultural products are bought, for the various assistance programs. That doesn't seem unreasonable to me, although who knows. But ultimately the impact is not those short-term annual sales. The impact is, as I said, people stop turning to the U.S. If they can't get aid from the U.S., if they can't get wheat, rice, whatever the other big staples are, which I've forgotten because I'm old, they soy and anyway, if they can't get them from us, they'll go elsewhere. And you know, as happened with Ukraine, right? When the Russians interdicted the Ukrainian wheat exports, people starved in Africa. In that case, they knew it was because of a war. And I don't think it hurt. Ultimately, when the grain started flowing again, I don't think their sales were hurt. In our case, who's doing this? Our government. People aren't going to be happy about buying U.S. stuff.
I kind of jumped it. My question is, it seems to me, closer, okay. It seems to me that Congress, particularly the Republicans, are abdicating their responsibilities and to Trump. And I'm wondering if you think they'll ever decide that they need to do their jobs again.
Not my area. I mean, it's not. As a citizen, I'm disgusted by it, but you know, I can't predict.
Thank you. Thank you for coming today. My question's about the impact on U.S. foreign policy of 9/11 and the immediate years following that. I was in the U.S. diplomatic service for 35 years, spanning 1986 to 2021. And I found that there was a real watershed in U.S. foreign policy and how we were perceived around the world in those immediate years following 9/11, when, for better or worse, the U.S. took a very militaristic approach. We launched the global war against terror, used rhetoric like either you're for us or against us, invaded and occupied Afghanistan, invaded and occupied Iraq. And that last one in particular, the invasion and occupation of Iraq on what proved to be erroneous intelligence or perhaps false pretexts, that really impacted the way that many people around the world, many organizations, many countries around the world really began to doubt the U.S. as a model and as someone to admire and to rely on. And I'm just wondering, what are your thoughts on that period?
Well, I absolutely agree with you. So much so, people forget that immediately after 9/11, even Iran, our great Satan at that point, because Russia was in disarray, even Iran sent condolences and sympathy after 9/11. There were demonstrations there, which I'm sure was kind of, you got to show up and condemn the great Satan, because that's how those societies work. But I couldn't agree more with you. I was asked, I was recruited. The State Department came back to me about 2003 or whenever they started having the, I forget what they called them, but it was the diplomats that went out with the teams to the different communities, and they wanted me to go. And they said, we'll give you, not only will you get your salary that you had when you retired, and not only will that year add to your retirement credit, which would mean a lifelong increase, but you can keep receiving your pension while you're there. And here's how I felt then and how I feel now. I don't agree with this war at all. I think it's a disaster, and I refuse. Apart from the fact that I don't speak Arabic, my areas of expertise are East Asia and Africa. Other than that, so yeah, I agree with you. When I was fairly newly retired when 9/11 happened, and I got asked in a couple of places to give my reaction, and I wrote basically what I wrote, which I still have somewhere on a disk drive, is that this is not the way to win the hearts and minds of the countries, that were involved in this. I forget who he was. There was an Afghani writer who wrote an op-ed at the time called "Give Us Bread, Not Bombs." And generally, both retirees and active, service, foreign service people all felt that sending in the troops and the CIA and all to Afghanistan was a big mistake. What should have been sent in were people, USAID, build roads, build schools, all of that. So I'm with you. Yes, hi.
Hi. So I'm wondering what your thoughts are about the current administration's threat to try to charge Europe or other places where they might provide military assistance. It's my impression from history, you can correct me if I'm wrong, that was the mistake following World War I that probably led largely to World War II in 20 years with reparations, and that we took a different tact following World War II. So I'm wondering what you think about that. And the second part is, if they follow through with that threat, is Europe and Canada prepared to say, that's fine, you pay us back for all of the lives and wealth that we gave to the United States when it was the only time that the NATO treaty was invoked?
Well, the first question is easy. Nobody, to my knowledge, is asking them. I mean, I know that the president says things like, they should pay us back, but there's a very important conditional verb in there, should. What he's actually asked for, as I understand it, is for the Europeans to contribute the share of their common defense that's specified in the treaty that created NATO. And the Europeans said, yeah, you're right. We've relied on you too much. Also, there are movements in all of the countries where there are U.S. military establishments to get them out. And there's one reason: nuclear weapons. That's how I know. I mean, I'm on a committee. Pax Christi is an international organization, and I'm on a committee that's working on nuclear disarmament issues with people from Germany and Belgium and Italy, and I can't remember, there's a fourth country. Anyway, and they all have active movements trying to get the U.S. military out, not because they're anti-American, but because in all of those places there are nuclear weapons, and they don't want them. Now, the second one, I don't know.
So, in all your years related to Africa, can you comment on Elon Musk being raised in South Africa?
My first overseas posting with the U.S. Information Agency was Pretoria, South Africa, under apartheid. A lot of white South Africans adjusted. They're not happy about the corruption in the government. But a lot didn't. I don't know Elon Musk, so I can't tell you much about him, but I think he's a jerk. Okay? And the only evidence I have is his preference for male children with a multiplicity of mothers, his idiotic way of naming the various Tesla models, the egregiously bad design of the Cybertruck, and his X feed. I mean, he's a jerk. He may be a genius, because God knows there have been genius jerks. Does his South African childhood have anything to do with it? Maybe, I don't know. Who's next?
So you said that some of your expertise lies in Southeast Asia. Can you talk a little bit about what you think is going to happen there, and especially with China and Taiwan, and give us some perspective there on how you think things could play out?
Something I know something about. So, Taiwan is very nervous. They were happy all through the Biden administration. Now they're watching carefully what is going on with President Trump, Ukraine, because they can draw the parallels. I don't know how it will end. China has often said it wants a peaceful resolution, and they're right. Taiwan was part of China until the Japanese took it over in the late 19th century, I think it was. So, and there are a lot of Taiwanese now, second and third generation, whose roots are in mainland China, because an awful lot of Kuomintang people went over there, after they lost to Mao. As far as what I consider the real Southeast Asia, that's a very tense spot. And some people think that a lot of what the president is saying about Europe is to allow for a much more aggressive military pivot to Asia. If that's true, the Philippines will be relieved immensely, because right now they're kind of in the forefront. Indonesia has never trusted China, partly because it has a long history of Chinese residents in Indonesia, and it's a bloody history because the Indonesians killed a lot of them in 63 to 65. There's a great, well, I won't go into that. Anyway, it's anybody's guess how risky the situation is there. Here's a long-term perspective. Every millennium or so, China decides to go out into the world. Historically, this is, right? And they do go out in the world, and sometimes militarily. But the net effect is after 100 years or so, they go back. What they leave behind are business people and traders, entrepreneurs. So the net effect is pretty good, unless you pass anti-Chinese laws like we did. Although now, those are a thing of the past, and it's a lot better for Chinese Americans.
Maybe one more question?
Okay, you guys are in control.
I've done a lot of work in Ethiopia and other places, and to your last point, China has very heavily invested in infrastructure development in many of these countries, and throughout the country, you just see Chinese in all sectors. And I guess the question pertaining to what you said earlier is it sounds like China is really positioning itself to take on the role that the U.S. used to have in terms of supporting infrastructure and development in many of these countries, increasing their influence.
Absolutely. They've been doing it for a number of years. I think it's called the Belt and Road Project, which is across the world. They're building infrastructure. It's interesting because when I first started working overseas, the Chinese were financing very large-scale construction projects, but they tended to be showcase things. A soccer stadium for the Africa Cup, or a fancy cultural center of some kind. Now they're building ports and roads and infrastructure, basically. And from what I read, they're beginning to position themselves to go right in as aid shuts down and start distributing food, distributing medicines, financing small businesses. Yeah, they are. That was easy. Thank you.